Thank you very much, Shani. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the third of the webinars that I've done. Today, we're looking at the biomechanics of starts and drive phases. It pulls actually together quite a lot of the other webinars that we've already done. There's quite a lot of cross-reference, so there's parts where I haven't gone into detail, but I will point you at in the direction of some of the other webinars perhaps to have a look at. Basically tonight, looking at drive phase of biomechanics of starts and drive phases. This is very much an introduction. It's not going to hit the amount of detail I'd perhaps hit on from backside mechanics, things like that. It is a basic introduction into what you need to look for, how you introduce it, how you develop it, and a lot of information across quite a few of the other coaches that I've had the pleasure to work with over the last few years. So hopefully to show you that, you can gain different ideas from different coaches and hopefully put it into your own training programs. So first of all, it's not rocket science, unless you're the one in the rocket. Blocks aren't rocket science. Everyone gets completely hung up on them, especially the athletes, on the fact that, it's blocks. It's a start. All you are doing is anchoring their feet into a position so that they can produce more power. There is nothing more than that. Hopefully, if you get nothing else from tonight, it's to debunk the myth that there's something really great and precious about coaching blocks. There isn't. Athletes get overly hung up on them, and it's something that I really try and break them back on, which we'll have a look at, and just talk to them about movements, about speed, just about feeling things rather than actually doing it, and trying to take away some of the myths about it. So, I was telling Shani earlier about one of my athletes that she's now a brain surgeon, one of my old athletes. So probably quite a good job. She overanalyzes everything now, but back then doing starts and coming out of blocks and stopping in a northern final because she didn't feel the block start was absolutely 100%, absolutely crackers. Sometimes you've just got to run, and it is sometimes just breaking it down with the athletes, making it a bit more simple, and just taking away some of the jargon, the rubbish that goes on around it, and just getting them simply thinking about how they do things, how they move, how they load up, and what they do. So, what are starts and drive phase mechanics? Hopefully, I'll answer that through the next hour and a bit. I'll answer the following questions. How do we set these up? How do we train these? When do we train these? And how do we prepare athletes? That's very much what I hope to get through through the course of today or this evening, and just to quickly talk you through. I am on a time limit. As people will know, I tend to waffle on for hours, but I'm really aiming to finish this by 7:45 at the absolute latest. So crack through those. A lot of you will already have seen this. It's been around for quite a few years. I'm not quite 100% certain it's 100% right, but it's a good starting point for what is the drive phase. So what starts the drive phase is. The drive phase is dictated basically by the shin angle. So as we can see there, at about 12 meters, the shin angle has altered from an athlete from over the 100 meters from 45 degrees up to 90 degrees. The torso angle, the athlete is still low, the torso is still coming up, but the shin is at 90. So that very much, the angle of the shin very much dictates exactly what the drive phase is. That roughly takes about 7 steps to cover that 12 meters. So if you look at Bolt's breakdown of his world record race, 12 meters, he covered 7 steps, and the shins had gone from 45 degrees coming out of the blocks to 90 degrees. It's saying there his maximum velocity was about 73%, but looking at that, it's about 7 meters, 8 meters a second, compared to a maximum velocity of 12. I think it's a tiny bit less than that. But it gives you the kind of ideas about the acceleration that's required straight out of the blocks through that really early phase of the race. And that is the absolute key important part to absolutely get right. Looking at this, as we can see at the start, stride length is short. It starts short, it starts to build up, and it gets longer. So at the start, we are looking at teaching shorter strides. Again, something I'll pick up. Stride frequency is longer, and that then shortens over the time. It's short at the start and then lengthens over the time. And the ground contact time is longer at the start as we're pushing. Again, something we'll look at, and shortens as we go through transition into maximum velocity and speed mechanics. So maximum velocity mechanics and then the speed maintenance phase. So again, something that we'll have a look at as we go through is just looking at the stride length, the stride frequency, and a tiny bit on the ground contact time. Again, I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail. I'm not going to pull out Ralph Mann's book and go through this ground contact time needs to be this length of time, this ground contact time needs to be this length of time. But it will be a very simplified look at how we do things, how we introduce it, with a view to making sure we get things, the absolute fundamentals right of it. So just to give you an idea about what we're looking at, I thought it was worth introducing a video early on, just to give you an idea of a slow motion start. This is the full race, but I will only play part of it. So if you just have a quick look, have a look at some of the movements, have a look at the stuff we've already looked at, look at the short stride, look at the angles of the shin, look at a few of the things we've talked about, and then we can perhaps pick on those as we go through. So if you look at that. As he comes out, we see shin bent, pushing back, longer ground contact times than we've been at top phase. I will just very quickly play that again. So really longer ground contact times than we'll see later, but still really quite quick contact times. Don't propose to go through that in any more detail than that, but just wanted to hit that fairly early on about what we're looking for, what we're going to be talking about this evening, and how we're going to take things on. So starting from that, no, I don't want to see you saying again. Sorry about that. Starting, the aim is obviously the development of maximum horizontal velocity. So we're going from zero and looking to absolutely maximize the horizontal velocity over that short period of time. That's achieved by placing the body in the best biomechanical position, something we'll look at, and how you teach your athletes that. So how to get your athletes in the best biomechanical position to apply force. Big thing for me is the body needs to be able to control those forces. There's massive forces created through this phase, absolutely huge forces, and the body's in a really unnatural position. We really need to be able to get the athletes to learn how to stabilize. And I think this is, I'm sure one of the questions that will come up later is when to introduce blocks for young athletes. It's when they're able to actually control themselves. You may get a new athlete that can't control the power that they've got. I'd hang off using blocks, but it's when they're able to control the body, able to control the force that they're producing without it dropping away, and them seeing twisting through the hips, twisting through the knees, twisting through the feet. Then we'll look at how best to produce power as we go through the session. So, starting point of setting up blocks, which foot at the front? This is, sorry, it's not brilliant. It's a photograph I had to take of the book, and this is the only time I will go back to Ralph Mann's Mechanics of Sprinting. This is basically a force graph of the horizontal forces produced off the blocks. And as we can see, there's the top line you can see is the force produced by both feet. The bottom two lines are the force produced by the front foot, is the big speed, initial spike of power that's created. So off the back block, we see a massive early spike of power that only lasts literally 0.15 of a second. So from the gun going off to the foot leaving, 0.15 a second of really, quite large power. The front foot, as we can see, creates power over a much longer period of time. So we see the front foot pushing, again, fairly obvious. We explode off the back foot, push off the front foot. We're seeing a lot more power created off the front foot. And then that obviously creates more power than the back block. And, people sort of say, why is that? Well, it's fairly obvious. The back foot leaves a block. You're pushing rather than through 2 feet, through 1 foot. So you're carrying your whole body weight through 1 foot. So there's bound to be extra power created through the single foot phase than there is a double foot phase. So which foot at the front? The rear foot has a large spike of force, as we saw. The front foot pushes over a much longer period and does a much greater amount of work and is controlling the whole body. So whilst at the later stage of the start, the front foot pushes by itself, to me, it makes common sense that the rear foot therefore needs to be the fast one, not necessarily the strong one, and the front foot is the strongest foot as it does the most work. How do we work this out? Athletes that play any kind of sport that involves kicking, it will tend to be the kicking foot tends to be the fastest foot, and the strongest foot is obviously the one that does all the work on the floor. So I would tend, as a very, very easy guide, is to put the foot that they kick with in the back of the blocks, and the foot that they don't, obviously stays on the ground in the front. Another way to work that out, quick one with athletes, is just get them to put their arms by the side. When you say go, get them to cross the hands as quickly as they can across the body. And the hand that finishes closest to the body tends to be the fastest side of the brain. In fact, it's the other side of the brain that's fastest, but it will tend to be the fastest side of the body. So actually, in this case, what you would have is your right foot in the back of the block, left foot in the front, because that shows that the fastest leg's in the back. So you want a really quick reaction off there and the strongest leg at the front. How does this apply to disability athletes? I quite like to bring everything back because actually it makes you think about things and it makes more common sense. I have CP amputee athletes that train with me, and what I will therefore do is with the CP athletes is put their weaker side in the back of the blocks, because we can cheat actually a bit in when they're in the blocks, is by getting them to load up, and we get a stretch reflex reaction off that, and then therefore the good side of the body is doing the majority of the work to get them into the power position that we'll talk about, that I'm really looking for. Amputee athletes, again, I will put, if the single leg amp I'll put the blade in the back block, because again, from that, if you think about it, we can really load the blades up. If they really load up, we can load up the carbon fiber so they get the spring back off, and then they can push through the front leg, which is really hard through the blades, to get them again into the right position to start to create some acceleration mechanics. As CP athletes get worse, or you're double amputee, you may just look at having a standing start, but with the blocks behind the feet just to anchor the feet, because they may struggle to be able to control it if they haven't got that coordination. And that's something for you to look at and play about with, depending on your specific athletes. But, they are just like able-bodied athletes. You have to look at them as an individual and work out what you're doing to get the best out of them. We won't click onto questions there. I ran through this as a quick draft with Shani, and it does go on, and I was talking about taking some of the stuff out later on, but we felt it was key to get onto that. So what we will do is I'll pick up 2 lots of questions throughout this, if that's okay, just to hopefully win us some time back. So the types of sprint starts, as I said earlier, the aim is to develop the maximum impulse in order to project us forwards, to get us into the right position, to accelerate as quickly as possible. Impulse is created basically force times time, so the amount of force created over the period of contact. The shorter the contact, the faster people will go. So it is, if you create more force over a short amount of time, the more power is created. Common question, distance between blocks. Bullet start will be less than 30 centimeters between the blocks. Medium stance will be 30 to 50 centimetres, and elongated stance greater than 50 centimetres. Obviously, it depends on your athletes, but the vast majority of times, the medium is the best. It creates the best combination of body position to develop forces and time on the blocks. It's something we'll look at, and I'll show you hopefully how you can measure that out with the athletes and how you can get it across. Distance from the line. So this is from the back of the start line to the box. There's a Winkler-Seagrave man method, which is basically you measure from the back of the start line to the rear block 3 foot lengths, and you measure from the back of the start line to the front block 2 foot lengths. Absolutely great if you've got an athlete with average legs compared to average feet, but sometimes you have athletes with smaller feet or bigger feet than the legs, and therefore that might not quite produce the produce the exact area that the distance that you want. So a good easy check is leg length, and to do that you basically sit the athlete just on the back of the line, so the bum is just on the back of the line. Get them to stick the leg out straight, and the straight leg length is a length to the rear block, and 60% of that is the distance to the front block. And if you measure those two, the measurements for your athletes will 99% of the times be somewhere between those, and you might vary it a bit forwards, backwards, but you won't be too far wrong on that. It's all about getting something we'll look at, the athlete into the right position, and as I said from experience, somewhere in between these is correct. It shouldn't be massively different. And the other thing is actually a good way to show really young athletes who you're bringing into blocks is actually get them to mark out where their normal start position is, mark these out, and it won't be too far different than they're probably used to starting at anyway, without blocks in races. So it just shows them that actually you're not changing much. All you're doing is anchoring the feet to give them a bit more power. Pedal angle, the stretch shortening cycle, I've talked about that quite a lot in the front backside mechanics that we did. The stretch shortening cycle is basically is the ability to absorb force and for it to spring back. So the stretch, if that's my ankle joint, that's the stretch, and the shortening, so you get a real shortening, and then as soon as you let go, you get a stretch back. And that's the basis that you're working on in getting that initial explosion off that rear block, that really quick initial explosion off the rear block. I find athletes like, especially when they come to blocks, is like to have the blocks quite high. If they've got the high, it absolutely minimises the amount of that stretch action that they can get. And it takes quite a lot of time and a bit of persuasion to get them to drop the back of the block so they can really load into it to get that power. And again, you might need to spend a bit of time just getting them into that and getting them to understand how it feels. And again, we'll look at how we do that and how you bring it in. But basically, it's as low as flexibility will allow. If you've got somebody who's really, really inflexible and can't get the heel back in, you will then just perhaps move the block up a tiny bit. Rear block is usually slightly higher than the front block. The reason is the rear leg, as we'll look at, is slightly straighter. So therefore, to get that same stretch reflex action, it needs to be tighter. So, again, we'll try and pick up on that as we go through and build down that in a bit more detail. But if you're there or thereabouts, you won't be too far wrong. Foot position depends on pedal heights. The Americans quite like the big long pedals on the blocks, which is great because you can really load through. Quite a few of the British blocks are a lot shorter and a lot smaller, and it's really sort of hard for young athletes to load up because the heel's not on the blocks, the heel's going over the blocks. So perhaps an easy thing for them to starting off is just to put the front spikes into the ground so it stretches, and that also has the the action of stretching the fascia and the tendons in the foot a bit more to give them a bit more spring. Thing to be aware of on that, though, is once they start getting into competitions where there are where you've got timed measurements and you've got pressure pads on the blocks that will give an automatic false start, athletes can't have their toes in touch with the ground, because then obviously they can fire out and explode out without setting off the false start equipment. So at that stage they will have to have their spikes fully into the block. It's pedal height, the back height, I think it is. Yes, it is. So the height of the actual block. Placing the blocks, again, fairly obvious, but it still astounds me how many athletes I see setting up blocks and then pointing in all directions. For short sprint hurdles, short sprints and hurdles, the blocks are in the middle of the lane, quite obviously. Blocks are pointing straight down the track in a straight line. Again, fairly obviously, but you will see them, even on a straight line, have angles, so it's something just worth reminding them about. Make sure your athletes stand on the front of the back of the blocks to make sure those are secure, so they're actually dug in. There's some tracks where the tracks are pretty hard and there's not much purchase into the tracks. At those, I try and get the athletes to put a separate set of blocks sideways on behind their blocks, especially as they get older and they're producing more power, just so that the blocks don't slip back, because again, that's quite dangerous. So it's just something that it might be worth having a look at. And we'll briefly look at the placement for longer sprints at the end, although Mike Leonard covered this in an earlier webinar looking at running the bends, where he looked at block placement. I'll briefly touch on that, but if you want any more detail, it's worth having a look back at Mike's webinar presentation. Set position, I will show you some videos in a minute. It's a lot of me talking. Set position, shoulders over the hands. We'll look at a photo of this in a second. So shoulders over the hands, elbows not absolutely locked out, slight bend in the elbows. Locked out creates a lot of tension through the arm and prevents movement. Just a slight bend allows, as you explode, to create that initial movement, and as you come out, again, something we'll have a quick look at. Hips above the shoulders. To produce the kind of forces that you need, the hips need to be slightly above. We'll look at that. Flat back. Again, we'll look at why you need a flat back. So neutral head position, flat back. We'll look at how we control the flat back a bit further, just elongating the core and what we do on that. Lower legs are about 45 degrees to the track. So you look at the bend, it's about 45 degrees to the track. The angle of the front knee is between 90 and 110, and rear knee is 120 to 135. I'll show you why in a minute, Brian, 45 degrees when you actually look at the legs in a second. So front knee 90 to 110, rear knee 120 to 135. I always go with 90 and 120. Every bit of research I've done that makes the most sense, right from Valerie Bortsoff's early research into block settings through, pretty much has them around 90 and 120, which is pretty much where I stick them. Body weight evenly over feet and hands, holding breath to tighten the stomach muscles, and that's what helps to elongate the back and just create that stability through there. And the most important for me is, as we talked about, the stretch reflex reaction loading up through the ankles and feet into the block. So if we have a quick look at Usain Asivapal's position here, what we can see is, I don't know whether you can see my cursor on this or on the presentation, but what we see is a really flat back, hips slightly higher than the shoulders, just over the hands, neutral. There you go, Shani's doing it for me, thank you, Shani. Neutral head position. We have a, if you look at the leg angles here, actually to the track, or from the foot to the leg, we're seeing about a 45 degree or 90 degree angle, actually, sorry, there, off there. And then the front leg, we're seeing 90 degrees on the front and 120 degrees on the back. But the most important thing is just really look at the feet, look how they're loaded into the blocks, look at what position they've got. And the 45 degrees, Brian, comes from, actually, if you run a line across from the top of his foot, sort of parallel line with the track, that angle there is around 45 degrees, if that makes sense. So from the top of the sort of by the ankle joint, run a line across, we've got roughly about a 45 degree angle, sort of if you took him in line with the track. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense on that. Any questions? We will stop for some questions at this point. No, it doesn't, because if they had really, really short legs and you did 60%, Stu, yes, it would. But, you know, short legs tend to mean short feet, and you'd probably be in that kind of position anyway. That's why I said, as a general rule, the bullet starts don't work. But if you've got a particularly short athlete, it may be there in the range of that bullet start anyway, just because of leg length, foot length, everything else. Measuring those two will tend to give you a fairly accurate picture that you can then get them back into that position you saw, roughly into that position you saw Powell in there, with those angles, with that back, with the hips at the right height. You'll tend to get them into about the right position. So yes, if you've got somebody with really short legs, then that you may end up that it's classed as a bullet start, but because of the legs, actually it isn't. If you've got somebody with massively long legs, I have a 6'5" athlete, and I bet, I've never really measured him. He's got the measurements, but I bet if we worked out the difference in those, it might actually look at an elongated start. But they're the sort of two ends of the spectrum. If you look in between those, the vast majority are sort of the medium start stance. Low angle of rear leg. The low angle of the rear leg is basically, if you've got a lower angle of the rear leg than 120 degrees, all that will happen is the force of the athlete, because that will drop their bum back down. So if you imagine, you looked at the Powell picture, the bum was slightly higher than the shoulders. If you drop the rear leg down, that bum starts to drop down. If you do that, the force of that's produced off the blocks basically fires the athlete upwards. Remember, when we come back to it, the whole force production thing is about creating, through this phase, creating the horizontal velocity. So creating velocity backwards, not creating vertical velocity upwards. It changes as we go through the running cycle. So at the very first, we are talking about, you know, really focusing on driving backwards, and then over time that transfers through to the run, till when we get into maximum velocity speed, we're really then looking at what is created, what's created downwards to create them upwards, but still keeping an element of backwards. So the focus of the two changes. The best way of describing it is, you know, if you want to accelerate an object from 0 forwards, you've got to put the force in the opposite direction. It's the laws of physics. So if you want to push a car, start a car, you don't push downwards on the car, you push backwards to move the car forwards. Well, it's exactly the same with the bodies. We need to get ourselves into a position where we can apply force backwards in order to accelerate the athlete forwards, and that's the reason we're getting into those positions. We will come on to the arms. I tend not to give the athletes a big focus on the arms. Certainly on the forwards action, we will look at the arms. I'm a great believer in the athletes. Yes, they do need to use their arms, but they basically counterbalance what the legs are doing. So out of the blocks, yes, we will talk, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is about the split of the arms, what we teach them, how we do it. But my biggest focus is not on a split. You'll see a lot of coaches talking about splitting the arms. That to me brings a focus in the arm coming forwards, and I really want the focus on the arms coming backwards. So we talk a lot about punching with the thigh, driving the foot backwards, and we counterbalance that with the arm movements. So I tend to talk more about backwards movements through this phase by an absolute country mile than I do forwards movements. And it's a very it's a very calculated thing that I do. If you talk about any movement forwards, it tends to be the athlete will focus on that and then let the foot get away from them, so we don't keep that bend chin angle. Remember, first 7 or 8 steps, 45 degrees coming out backwards into the track. It will tend to be then that they'll let that foot get away from them because they're letting their arm come out. They let the foot get away from them, and therefore put the foot in front of the centre of mass, where what we really want is the foot behind the centre of mass to accelerate them forwards. Yeah, that's exactly the same, John. Front foot should be the strong foot. So if you're talking about the foot that you long jump off or hop on, that's going to be a strong foot. So it's exactly the same. So the foot that you don't, that drives the knee forwards, will tend to be the fast foot, and the front that you actually hop on or jump on and actually take into the long jump will be the strong foot that actually then should be in the front block, because that does the most work. So it's exactly the same, same reasoning and the same sort of understanding about that. Cool. We'll pick up some more questions a bit later. I will give you my email address, so if there's anything in particular that you need at the end, feel free to contact me. Now we come on to the arms. So after the gun, photo or motor tasks, it's got to be front arm, rear leg, has to be the focus. So rear leg has got to explode out, and if the rear leg is exploding out, the front arm has got to come forward to counterbalance that one. So there has to be some of that. We do quite a lot of work. Charlie reminded me of it, from 3-point starts, where I will actually start with them with their arm up into the position that we're wanting to be, one arm down and the other arm up, so that they can really focus on driving that arm back and counterbalancing it with the front arm. Tend to teach them, as it says there, about a four-arm lead rather than a straight arm lead. It creates a very long lever. Back arm comes back, and a forearm lead, so that we can really snap that back for the first couple of steps, just to keep the speed of the turnover on that, and just to keep them, just to get those first couple of steps, even though the longer steps, as quick as we possibly can. And we will have a look at a fair few starts in a second. Arms go above parallel. It is a split. I don't talk to the athletes about a split. I talk to them more about the legs and counterbalancing with the arms. It is a split, but we, rather than talking about a split, which athletes automatically say about splitting your arms, they'll go wham, and it stays there. We very much talk about, the arm driving, but really punching the arm backwards. The best description I've had of it is, if you imagine on the dragon boats, the drums that you get is that bang, 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 and the focus is on the arms coming back on that, not coming up. Biggest cue is really starting to drive their hips forwards, which we'll look at, and it's forwards. This goes back to the point earlier, not upwards. We want them to really drive those hips forwards. The reason for getting the hips forwards, and again, it's absolutely key for CP, amputee athletes. The reason for getting the hips forwards is it allows the hip flexors to start firing, and they will fire much faster than the quads will. If you want to get your athletes to feel it, get them to run with the bum slightly backwards. They will really struggle to get those legs through. They've got to think, and it's something I'll pick up on in a sec, they've got to think about keeping those hips engaged so that they can get the hip flexors firing to really drive that, pop that thigh through to drive that foot back. And that's the sort of terminology I talk about, is popping the thigh, keeping the shin bent, driving the foot back, popping the thigh, drive the foot back, popping the thigh, driving the foot back. We talk about the pop for a really specific reason, because sort of pop is really quick, fast firing movement rather than an elongated movement. Low rear heel recovery. Again, we'll look at that a bit further. I don't teach the toe drag. I despise a toe drag. I can't see the reason in it. But a low recovery, so how they bring the foot through, is absolutely key. And if they're popping the thigh, that foot will not come up the back anyway, because the reason the foot comes up the back, it tends to be, is they start firing through from actually firing through from the quads, and actually bringing the leg through and over, rather than thinking about really popping through, driving back, pop through, drive back. Takeoff angle, circa 45 degrees coming out of the blocks, but that very much depends on age. That tends to be decent senior athletes. World-class athletes are a bit less than that. Youngsters, you probably won't be able to get them out at 45 degrees. They probably won't be able to hold the kind of forces that they're producing through that phase. So they may be a bit higher, so don't get hung up on that early stages. Right, video 2. I told you that was enough of me talking. Video 2, just basically taking the Asper Pal start in slow motion, just so we can see that explosion off the blocks, exploding through the hips, what happens to his back, and actually what position he gets out into. I'll just run this through to basically the position we saw at earlier. So we're there, through at 90 degrees. What we can see is massive forces created off this back block. Massive spike of power. The back foot doesn't collapse into the block. It's so loaded, all it's doing is exploding off the back block with a massive punch and push through the front block, so that we then end up fairly short, low recovery through that phase. And the position we end up in is basically the triple extension position we'll talk through, with the hip engaged, knee engaged, ankle engaged, and we see a massive amount of force coming off there, totally straight, and massive hip engagement in order that that front thigh can pop through, keeping the shin angle bent in order that you can push backwards. So set position, what is important? Stability / core strength. As you've seen there needs to be a massive amount of core strength. I had a couple of people saying they can't see the videos. If you, I don't know whether that's a problem, Shani. If you can't, I can email these videos out at the end with the presentation so that you've got them as well. So set position, what's important? Stability, core strength. They need to be able to control through a massive amount of power. Could anybody see that video? Yeah, others can see it. You need to be able to control that explosion out, which creates a massive forces, really trying to pull the athletes in different directions. You need to be able to control that, and it's something that needs to be really trained into them. Upper body strength in order to hold that. Foot strength, something we'll look at. The ability to load and explode off that foot's absolutely key. It's one of the key things I've probably changed in my training in the last few years, is the amount of foot strengthening work we do, the amount of loading work we do, and how we do it and what we do. Focus, being able to react to the gun. But the biggest thing is relaxation. It's a really explosive, fast movement. Yes, they need to be controlled through the core, but we need them to move really freely through the arms and the legs in order to create that power and that explosion out of the blocks. Introducing the blocks to athletes, I tend to work backwards, not get them running backwards, but work backwards out of the blocks. I tend to teach them, firstly, the drive phases, understand what position you need to be in and how you drive out of the blocks, which is fairly easy. We'll look at how you can do that. From that, I then teach them the movements to the triple extension, so how they can explode and get that triple extension. Then we teach them, and I forgot to put this in, then we teach them sort of 3-point starts where they can bring that down a bit, and they can then have one arm free to really start to focus on being able to relax and drive the arms. Then we'll put them, then we'll look at the explosion from the block. So that really explosive power, really looking at posture, hips and loading. So it tends to become some quite specific start drills that we do for that, which again, we'll have a look at. And finally introduce, the last thing I introduce is the blocks. We will look at how you introduce some of those, what you do, how you do it as we go through. That's the stuff that I've left in at the end. And we'll introduce that as you come through, we go through the presentation. So very quickly, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, drive phase mechanics. Obviously, you've got power coming out through here. You've got the leg wanting to come out of the back, the body wanting to fall. The whole thing you're trying to teach is to minimize what happens. So if you see on the blue arrow coming out at the back is minimize what happens as the athlete has got out of that plane of movement. So if we look at some of the videos later, we'll see there is very little outside the back of that line of the body. If you take a line through the body, there's very little happens at the back. What they do is as soon as that foot leaves, they are thinking about really popping that thigh through to drive back. So they're creating some speed of turnover, and they're not letting the body letting the leg come up so the body over rotates. They're keeping thinking about stable and thinking about that sort of position there and being able to push back and minimizing what happens out behind that. Obviously, the center of mass is trying to rotate forwards, and the leg that's pushing is starting to rotate backwards. So it can feel, when you get a really good start, an athlete will feel like they're about to fall flat on the face. Actually, if they don't fall flat on the face and they keep pushing, that is a brilliant start. That's roughly how it should feel, but they have to keep pushing, and it's giving them that confidence. And that's why I teach sort of the drive phase stuff first. It's giving them that confidence that if they keep pushing, they will keep going forwards. And I use the analogy of them running down a hill and say, when you run down a hill, what happens? Who's run really fast down a hill? What happens? And all the legs do is come through fast, really fast to stop them falling flat on the face. Well, that's pretty much what I want on the start. I want that leg coming through really fast and then powering backwards to drive them forwards. Bottom side on there is just low heel recovery during the drive phase, reduces time to recover the leg. So if they've got a massive, we saw Powell's foot come through roughly about that sort of angle. If you follow the red and the lifting the left foot right up, there's a massive amount of wasted time there. So we're thinking about pop the thigh, drive the foot, pop the thigh, drive the foot, and that will get the low recovery. That's what I teach them, rather than talking about what I want is the low recovery. I'll say, right, what I want is you to, the body position to be in that place. I want you to pop your thigh, drive the foot, pop the thigh, drive the foot. So the piston action with the legs is exactly the right analogy. So it's that really pop, so the piston, and drive the foot back. And I tend not to talk too much about the sweeping the toe. Again, they get over fixated on that. And we tend to just work on that and keep to that. So what we've already talked about here, as we can see through the phase, from the block clearance, 45-degree angle to the track, through the leg, and as they move forwards, that angle increases. So as you can see, the shin angle increases at 6 to 7% per stride. So at 7, we're at about 7 steps, 8 steps, we're at 90 degrees. The torso angle only increases at 2 to 3% per stride. Therefore, your torso is coming up quickly. So once the shin hits there, the torso is still leaning slightly. And that's when we transfer from the drive phase to the transitional phase, with the end of the transition phase dictated about what position the torso is compared to the body. So again, I can send this out with the key coaching points if people don't have this already. So summary of the drive phase, 75%, I think is a bit less based on that, but we'll go with that. Of total acceleration is achieved in the first 7 steps. Even at 60, 65%, that is a massive, huge amount of acceleration in a very, very short period of time. And we really need to teach the athletes to set themselves up and teach them how to do that. Massive forces produced, massive acceleration forces produced, and they really need to learn how to apply that kind of force to push themselves forwards. The application of horizontal force is the key component in the drive phase, quite obviously. Piston action, popping action, whatever you want to call it, for hill recovery in this phase of the sprinting. Shins remain at an angle for the first 7 to 8 steps. An ankle joint remains tight, as we've seen, and foot primed, and we'll see a bit more of that as we go through. So another video is just so you can have a look at some of those points we've raised, and give me a chance to have a drink. Just so you can have a quick look at those. There's another video here of Gatlin with 2 female sprinters, just so you can get an idea of the starts and the kind of piston action, the low recoveries, the bodies, the angles in the set position, where the feet are driving from, look at the power creation, everything we've already discussed, just so you can have a quick look at that. So we see shin angle bent, not much collapse on the foot driving backwards, keeping the shin bent. So that's 7, 6, 7 there, and we're starting to get to about 90 degrees. Body still bent. Focus is still, part of the focus is now transferring to forcing the foot down, but it is still really trying to accelerate him and push him backwards. And as he transitions through, starts to lift, and we then start to see more focus on the foot powering downwards, but with some still backwards movement coming in. Sorry, just get back onto the presentation. So back onto the presentation. Quick flick through that questions as well, if that's okay. Again, just conscious of time. So what we saw there is coming out of the blocks, real explosion of the hips, control through that initial long push, stable movement with a low recovery through the first few steps. Foot strength, we saw real force going through that foot, but very little collapse. If people have seen the other stuff I've done, I show a very good video of Dyron Robles doing a hurdle start, and you see absolutely no collapse through his foot. It is so tight. He's able to control so much that he's able to absorb, and power back off with very little collapse. And it's something that I work a lot on with the athletes with, is just thinking about how they tighten the foot, how they strengthen it. And one of the things we talk about is actually just spreading the little toe out slightly, just to create that tiny bit of tension through the foot. I don't want to create tension through the body, but I want to create tension in specific places where we need it: core, the foot, the ankle joint, various other things. Control of core during movement. That's an immensely complex movement that they're performing. Loads of forces, loads of power going through them from different directions. We need to train them to do that. We need to train younger athletes in order to be able to control those kinds of movements. And even senior athletes is really look at how we control core through movement. Something I'll briefly touch on. I haven't got a huge amount of time, but something I will very briefly touch on a bit later. The ability for the muscles to extend and contract quickly. And that goes back to the relaxations thing. We need muscles to be able to extend and fire back really, really quickly. Which muscles, how? Hip flexors to me are one of the absolute cores. And then on the push back, it's obviously glutes firing, hamstrings firing, to really fire that leg backwards in order to create that power forwards. How do we teach that? If you go to the Athletics Hub website, which if you're if you're qualified England coach, you can get access to, there's some examples of some of the practicals I did a few years ago. I've changed a bit of the stuff I've done since then, and I've lost more hair. I've probably put on more weight, but never mind. But there's a few examples of some of the practical stuff. And one thing I'm really keen to get the athletes to do is, through the drive phase, is getting them to think about what position and move, what position they need to be in order to create power. So one thing we do a lot of is getting them in pairs and getting them to think about what position you need to be to create power. So I start them off and say, do one with your bum backwards, do one where you stood up straight, and then do one where you get into a position where you think you can create the most power. We ended up actually, I've had to take some videos. Obviously, I can't get down to the track at the moment. Our track isn't open, so I've had to dig out some old videos. I'd have changed, if I'd had the perfect world, I'd have changed this and got those hips slightly more engaged and that foot a bit further back. But it hopefully gives you an idea that if you took those hips in and just brought that would bring the body a bit further. He's in a really good position as though he's coming out of the block. So I get them to feel what position they can create the most power in. And once they can feel that, we have a chat about, okay, well, if that's the position you can create power, what position do you think you need to be in to create power when you come out of the blocks? And they'll sort of say that position, right? Well, we need to set you up in order to get you in to that power position. So we talk a lot about getting them into the power position. Some examples of things you can do for the low foot recovery. We'll get a bit more into how you introduce a training into the athletes. So low foot recovery, low walking, running drills, wall drills, and exaggerated marker drills. I'll show you some videos of how you can do these. Sorry, I'm on video 4. I'm losing myself here. So video 4 is the exaggerated marker drills. This is Lauren Seagrave taking that.
There it is.
I'll just play that one again.
There it is. There it is.
So the reason for that is to basically introduce exaggerated drills, bring those cones in a bit closer, make the athletes really think about keeping that shin angle bent, firing the foot back, firing the foot back, firing the foot back, so that they then take it out into a run, and then you start to move those cones out to make it a bit more like they would in an actual race. But it's just an over-exaggerated movement that you get from that. Wall drills, again, I think this is a Lauren Seagrave video.
Ready?
There's Lorna Booth in the background.
Punch, punch.
Hello, Lorna.
Punch, 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 punch. Punch, 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 punch. Punch, 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 punch. Punch, 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 punch. Hey, stand up. Hey, stand up.
So again, just starting to introduce the basics of how you recover, how you push back, how you actually move things. You can see tight ankle joints, getting them roughly into a start position, driving the foot back. So push, 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 and get them thinking about popping that thigh that we were talking about, pushing the foot back, and it being a really fast, quick turnover and an action. Next video. I think I come through onto this one now. Is the no, I don't. No, I don't. I'll come on to that in a sec. So from the drive phase, I then move them back into the loading and explosion, teaching them Okay, that's how you drive, that's how you push, that's how you go. I'll show you one of the real key drive phase drills I do in a minute. It comes from a start drill, and I explain how I take that into a drive phase drill, which is one of the key drills that I do. From the drive phase, we move into the loading and explosion phase. That's the triple extension we talked about earlier, the push through the hips, knees and ankle. Core needs to remain engaged, and the purpose of doing these sort of exercises is to teach the athletes how to load and how to explode, but again, taking it back to relaxation and movement is the key whilst control is maintained. This is the other video. So again, some Lawrence Seagrave medicine ball throws, and then I'll show you one of my medicine ball throw exercises that we do. So video 6. So there, we're starting to get them into a position where they're starting. Rear leg slightly bent, front leg's in front, starting to think about loading and then exploding through the body in order to throw the medicine ball back.
Overhead backward.
I've adapted that one slightly. This is on the webinar, sort of training your athletes can do at home. We do quite a lot of this sort of stuff into a medicine ball throw from almost a start position. So front leg roughly about 90, it's not quite, back leg straighter, teaching them to load up. And what we get them to think about is exploding through the hips, switching legs and then chasing after the ball. And again, that is purely just to then start to introduce the idea about the loading, the explosion through the hips, how they do that, how they come out of it, and it's something that you can do throughout the winter. And the final one is the start drills, which again, to teach them how to load and how to explode. And I'll tell you how I take this then into an actual drive phase drill as well. So video 8. So on this, holding an athlete back so that they can learn how to really load through those ankle joints. Really, he's pushing forwards against my hands. He's really loaded up through the ankle joints, so that will get him you'll find he'll really spring out, and he'll probably struggle to actually maintain this at first because he won't have the confidence to hold it. But then if you do it a few times, you really start to get the confidence and learn how to actually control it. And the way I take that into the drive phase mechanics drill is I get the athletes in pairs, and unfortunately I haven't got a video of this again. I would have tried to drop a video of this in, is get the athletes in pairs, and basically we get the athlete into the power position you saw earlier. The other athlete holds their shoulders. What the athlete sort of pushes them for about 6 or 7 strides. The athlete at the front holding has to go back with them. So they're really getting them focusing on pushing back to push the other athlete forwards. Then after about 6 or 7 strides, the other athlete jumps out of the way and allows them to accelerate away, but really focusing on pushing back. And that's how I sort of take that drill into the drive phase. So we do the drive phase, then we take it into that and get them thinking about adding the two of them together. Hopefully that makes sense. And this is the position we ended up getting the lad you just saw there into. We got him into during that day, and again you can see the discussion on this where it goes. Get him into a really nice start position. He improved massively just over the space of a couple of hours, getting some really nice movements, some really nice angles there. Unfortunately at this, he just carries on, that arm starts to cross, and you'll see him, when you look at the video, see that arm cross a bit, which means rather than the focus be that arm coming back, he starts to fall on. But it was a real positive, is to say to him, look, you've got yourself into an absolutely amazing position. You compare yourself to any international, that is a really good position. If you think about just whipping that front arm backwards to get that foot backwards, or pushing the foot, whatever cue you want to use with your athletes, push that foot backwards, you will really fly off that start position. So that's sort of where we went through that day. So if you go back through if you go back through some of the early the stuff on Athletics Hub, there's a load of that on there. Other start drills, don't do many of these, but just to give you an idea of sort of different examples of some start drills, we've got a Dave Lease one onto a high jump bed from starts, just to teach the explosion.
But got to learn both. Can you go a little bit further back, like you were in the blocks? That's how you have your blocks, is it? Okay, off we go then. Bit low.
So a bit low, but teaching him that explosion, trying to get up to 45 degrees. He was probably out at about 35 because he had the bed in front of him, but teaching that explosion. Another one, this is, again, Dave Lease, hop start. Again, don't do a lot of these, but really good with younger athletes, just to teach that loading up that ankle joint to the explosion out. So teaches them how to absorb, load out, and really explode out off the blocks. Really good one with younger athletes to do that one. So a couple of different examples from other coaches. So once I've taught all of that, only then do I bring in the blocks. I want the athletes to understand how they move when they're coming out, to have that confidence that they can come out of the blocks, hold a position, and carry on pushing. So that's where the backwards movement comes. So drive phase, explosion, 3-point starts, some of the other start drills into blocks. So we tend to work our way backwards. I talk a lot to the athletes about feeling movements, understanding how they move, understanding how they create power, rather than just specifics. I'd rather they felt something. If they can feel it, they can correct it. If they feel the flowing, if they feel the movement, I know they're getting there as an athlete. In my experience, if they know what they need to be in, they know how to accelerate, and blocks is a hell of a lot easier. Focuses then on, once you get into the blocks, the posture, so the flat back, the core, the hips being engaged, not having the hips turned off. It's just starting to think about pre-engaging the hips slightly, then loading into the blocks, and then the explosion off that we talked about earlier. Any questions? How do you strengthen feet? I will look at that, Helen. That's the last thing we're going to look at, is actually how we start to work on some of these core things, how we strengthen the feet, how we actually start to work on some of that. So I'll pick that up, if that's okay, Helen, as we go through. What can you do to help me push back into the blocks? Is more ankle flexibility needed? And if so, how do I get this? Maybe something we'd need to have a look at. I believe pushing into the blocks is just teaching the athletes how to load. The one where you hold it, I've got 3 cues I use for loading into the blocks. One is holding the athlete's shoulders and getting them to push against you, and then getting that explosion out. The other is getting an athlete, one of the other athletes, to sit alongside them, and with the rear leg, grab hold of the top of the rear leg behind the knee and push the thigh into the block. So think about grabbing the thigh, grabbing the leg, and actually really pushing the thigh into the block, because that gets the same sort of thing as them pushing against you, but it's only the single leg. So it starts to get them an idea about how to load up. And the other one I do is one I nicked off a certain Donald Moss, who nicked it off Rainer Ryder, and there is nothing in athletics that's particularly new. And it's an Achilles tap. And the first time I saw it, I'm thinking, what on earth are you doing, Don? And all you do is sit behind the athlete, and when they get to the set position, is really fast on the back of the heel and on the Achilles, tap the foot really quickly. And when you say go, they fire out of that block like nothing you've ever seen. And the only reasons I can think of is because you're tapping the Achilles like that, what it's actually doing is getting that Achilles to pre-tense. So you're getting extra pre-tension in that, so you're getting that stretch reflex reaction. And the other real benefit of it is it's giving the athletes a cue that your hand is right on their heel. So rather than lifting the foot up, they tend to then drive outwards. So you get that forwards drive and the backwards push, which really, really works well. So those are the three cues that I tend to work on in helping athletes get a push back into the blocks. Back arm, pretty straight. The front arm will be bent, and the back arm, because it's really thrown back, will be fairly straight. I've got loads of videos, Anthony. If you drop me, I'll put my email address on at the end. And if you, if you drop me an email, I'll send you some emails, and it will show in slow motion quite a few of these, just different athletes with different starts. And actually, then you can have a look at that. But back arm, pretty straight, just through the first couple of movements. After that, you obviously want the arm bent because it's a long lever, but the power created on that backward action means that the arm does end up going straight. After that, after the first few steps, probably 2-3 steps, we then start talking about arms being more bent, because then you're talking about, again, you're talking maximum velocity mechanics and moving into it. You're talking about shortening this lever, so it's not a bigger movement, but the first few movements are really elongated movements where we're really pushing, hence why the arm straight. After that, it starts to bend as we start to transition through out of the drive phase, and more specifically really into the transition phase, we start to lift up and come out of it. Brill. So back to, was it Sally's question? How are these developed? Stability in this phase, basic core exercises, planks, any basic core stuff is brilliant for younger athletes. Older athletes, you really need to challenge them through core movements. We challenge core through movement quite a lot by talking to them about being able to control while they move through different planes. So we'll do a lot of medibands. It's different webinar, this one, but a lot of mediband movements where we're talking about core being tight and moving through a plane. While they're doing exercises, medicine balls out in front of them, medicine ball side to side, turning a medicine ball over the head, and it's all designed to work the core through movement. Younger athletes, all you need is a broomstick, any basic movements, broomstick over the head, starts to get them thinking about controlling whilst they're actually moving. So we started again, it's something I was going to bring in this winter, but because the season looks like it's going to be massively curtailed, we brought it in earlier, started bringing in a lot more broomstick work for all the athletes. The older athletes are using some heavier stuff, but actually getting them to do a lot of movements whilst holding the broomstick up overhead and barefoot. So we're starting to hit two things at once. More complex core exercise, again, it's a different webinar, but I'm really keen that I really challenge the athletes on movement. So the exercise you saw earlier, where you saw the low foot recovery drill that Lauren Seagrave was doing, we'll do that, but we'll put a medicine ball against the wall and put one hand on top of the other and then on the medicine ball. So it creates that instability. So as well as doing that, we'll do it, well, younger athletes, I'll teach them how to do it, but then the older athletes, I want to introduce instability. So we'll do that, hands on the ball. So they're really having to control through the core while they do that exercise. We'll also do ones where they have a mediband stretch between them, and this is quite impressive, this mediband stretch between them, and as they do the exercises they have to lift a hand off the wall, so it's trying to pull them sideways, so they're having to control through that plane of movement while they're doing the exercises, and really start to challenge some of the movement, core movement skills that they have. Basic upper body strength. They need to be able to hold half their body weight over their hands. Quite a lot of girls struggle to do that. Quite a lot of younger lads struggle to do that. So basic press ups, things like that within your training. If they struggle with the knees on the floor, just do basic press ups to start to strengthen the hands, strengthen the upper body. Foot strength, how important is this? Here you go, Sally. I told you I'd get onto it. Absolutely key. I will show some of the videos that I'll send out to you. Have some of the foot strengthening stuff that I do. Nabbed off Jonas but I'll share some of the exercises that we do through there. So this is some of the Tony Hadley foot strengthening stuff that he did with his athletes. Literally just walking on the track, heel down, up onto the toe, heel down, up onto the toe, heel down, up onto the toe. Other stuff, control of core through movements. Again, this sort of stuff, forwards, backwards runs, just trying to keep the core engaged. Sorry, trying to keep the core engaged. You can see there, as soon as he dropped his hips back, he slipped. So keeping the core engaged, keeping movement forwards, trying to keep the hips engaged, forwards and backwards. And this is a really good foot strengthening exercise as well. And the final video, again, another Tony Hadley one. Side to sides. Great start video this. So at a lower level, I try not to teach that drag around the outside. So at a lower level, hips coming through straight on, not letting any twisting happening. You've got control through movement, you've got foot strengthening, you've got everything in that. And hopefully that's the last of the videos. Hopefully from all of those videos you've taken something away, the fact that I've not taken one thing from one coach. I've not taken another thing from another coach. You've seen Jonas, you'll see Jonas, you've seen Tony Hadley, you've seen Lauren Seagrave, you've seen Dave Lease. There's information from loads and loads of different coaches. There's a slide from Clarence in a minute. Loads and loads of different coaches have inputted into my coaching. And the only way we learn as coaches is by opening ourselves up and going and seeing other coaches, talking to other coaches, actually developing ourselves. How important is the reaction time? I don't teach it. If they load, if they are focused, their reaction time will be good. So I've seen some people try and teach catching a rule in order to increase the focus, but if they are loaded, if they are focused, their reaction time will be good. If you set them up right, if you prepared them, their reaction time will be good. So I tend not to teach reaction time. I don't want them trying to jump the gun. We just teach them how to do all this sort of stuff. Control of core during movement, we've seen quite a lot of that, but other stuff is single leg exercises. Again, you can probably tell from some of the other stuff I've said, I'm quite absolutely passionate about disability athletics. My first athlete was a CP athlete, and I learned such a lot off Chris. It was unbelievable. Having Chris come into the group really made me stop to reassess myself as a coach. And made me do a lot more single leg stuff because he really struggled on one side. So, you know, if we did stuff two-legged, he'd favour his good side, and his good side would become stronger, and the weak side would become, you know, weaker comparatively. So I was like, no, we've got to go back on this, Chris. You're going to have to do loads of single leg stuff. And we worked the weak side more than we did the strong side. So we did lots of single leg squats, lots of controlled hopping and sticking, lunges, controlled lunges, hip strengthening exercises, more complex movements. So, you know, hopping with a med ball out in front, hopping with a stick in above the head, really to teach him how to control himself, and got massive results from it. Basic plyometrics, again, we've looked at this. There's another webinar, Introduction to Plyometrics. I'm not going to hit this. If you go back through Athletics Hub, there's a whole session on the basic plyometrics and the stretch reflex reactions and things like that. So please go back, have a look through if you didn't manage to see that one. Here you go, Clarence. Nabbed off you, straight from one of Clarence's presentations. Warm-up, preparation for starts. If the start is so important, do we actually prepare our athletes for it? Do we think about activating their core as part of the warm-up? Do we think about recruiting and activating the stabilizer muscles so they start to think about how to stabilize as part of the warm-up? Do we look at the mobility exercises that are going to allow them to get into the positions and explode out of them? Are there any diagnostic exercises that check, is there any tightness, any problems, anything else that we include in the warm-up? Are we actually doing something, an exercise, and looking at them and checking that what they're doing is right and whether there's any twisting, collapsing, why that is? Drills to reinforce correct neuromuscular pathways of sprinting. So are we thinking about that explosion? Are we thinking about some of the drills that we're going to get for the top end speed mechanics? And no passive stretching. It flattens the neuromuscular energy levels. Rolling, unless it's to do a specific trigger release before they race, I don't believe in. Yes, afterwards as rehab, but rolling should be about a release thing and be very specific rather than it's not a stretch. It's not stretching, it's just squashing the muscles. Do we want that before they go and race? I question whether we do. Any quick last questions, and then the last couple of slides, nothing much. Jeff Barrowclough. Jeff, I don't really have any younger athletes anymore, but the younger coaches who work with the younger athletes, yes, do it. And the reason why is they have them in different positions is basically to teach them about how they get out of something really quickly. And the reason is it's more of a fun learning thing. So lying on the back, okay, well, what did you do to get out of that really quickly to get into your start? Why did you do that? What was it for? What muscles did you push down? And you'll tend to find the ones that get out quickly, especially if they're lying with their heads facing down the track, are pushed into one side so they can twist across really quickly and push down the track. And you can see them pre-tense those muscles in the position to get themselves out quickly. So there's a learning cue for them from that. We say, okay, well, if you do that to get out of that position to get you down the track quickly, which muscles do you think you need to prepare and load up and get firing in order in a set position to drive you out quickly, which is the main reason we do that. It's a learning thing to start to teach them how to react, but then also which muscles to fire to make them react quickly. We don't do block training every week. I'm on a track where it's cold, it's windy, and Clarence is still on here. I've just had a quick check down the list of attendees. It's cold and it's windy, and Clarence came to visit me. My track overlooks the Mersey estuary. Clarence came to visit me from his nice warm little palace in down in London, and stood there. And I'm driving up there. This is God's honest truth. I'm driving up there thinking, thank God it's a nice night and I can get a quality training session done. I thought I can get some real quality across to, show Clarence what we do. And Clarence was sort of mentoring me at the time. And Clarence arrived. Well, I arrived. Clarence was already there. And he stood on the side of the track. He had about 5 coats on, 4 pairs of trousers. He stood there going, "Oh, do you coach in weather like this?" And I'm thinking, oh, thank God it's a nice night. You can't do it depends what facilities you have. You can't do blocks every week, but what we do is we do a lot of the movement stuff, a lot of the explosive training, a lot of the drills we do. Some of the start drills we've done pretty much come into the vast majority of sessions we do at least once a week. We do a lot of explosive throwing. We do a lot of the foot strengthening stuff now, so we do a lot that's going to help the starts without actually doing block starts, so that when we do the starts, the athletes are really used to it. We do a lot of the training out of 3/4 point starts for the faster stuff. So without bringing blocks in, I'm reinforcing start movements probably on average at least, even in winter, once every 2 weeks. And the summer it's every week, but I don't get hung up on having to come out of blocks to practice blocks. We can practice starts through a lot of other things that hopefully you've seen tonight. We can get the block starts and the movements by the drive phase, them pushing against another athlete and sprinting down the track. We can get lots of movement stuff really well without actually having to get them into the blocks. What books would I recommend? Number one book has to be that, The Mechanics of Sprinting and Hurdling by Ralph Mann. Has to be that book, just for understanding movement, understanding that. I've got a host of other books behind me on there, but the one I constantly refer to about how to move, how to do things, is really, really key and important to what we do and, you know, how we do it and my understanding of movement. Brill. There's just one last question that Sally's asked, which I'm trying not to look at the questions. Are you doing all the explosive work now after lockdown? Yes, I am. It's something that we're doing a lot of the stuff on grass. We're doing a lot of the sort of explosive stuff, a lot of the foot strengthening stuff. I can't go. I'm on a grass field at the moment. I've had one athlete slightly go over on an ankle already. We can't go 100%, but we're looking at a lot of the drive phase stuff, coming out, pushing, keeping the shin angles bent, and doing a lot of that with the spikes on grass, apart from last night when it was pouring it down. But looking a lot of the drive phase movement stuff coming out of lockdown on the grass. So yeah, no, we've started to introduce a lot of that at the moment. So finally, just very quickly, Mike Leonard covered this in his webinar in detail. Starts over the 200, 400. Obviously, it's on a bend. The aim is to run in a straight line for as far as possible. So what you want the athletes to do is to move the blocks towards the outside of the lane, not right on the outside, but towards the outside of the lane, and angle the blocks so that if they're in the blocks, they're basically running in a straight line to the top of the apex of the bend that they can see, and then just lining themselves up. So it will tend to be the outside hand is on the line, the back hand is slightly behind the line, just so that they're running in a straight line as far as they possibly can, so that it can explode out, run in a straight line before they get up to thinking about a bend. If you're interested in this stuff, Mike, I'm not going to steal Mike's thunder. Mike's done a whole webinar on running the bends and starting the bends. If you go back on Athletics Hub, all his details are on there. So finally, if we expect our athletes to be able to perform these complex movement skills, this goes back to the question earlier about how many starts. If we expect the athletes to be able to perform these complex movement skills, when do we practice them? How often do we practice them? If we expect them to do that in a race session or, you know, a race training session, they've got to be nailed on. They've got to do these movements without thinking about it. It's got to be something they just do and do and do. So yes, we might not do a block start session, but it's something, you know, if the biggest thing I've changed in all my years of coaching is how much of this stuff we actually do, to me, it's absolutely key for the 1 and 2 runners. So we do a hell of a lot more on this with a lot more focus on movement dynamics and movement skills all the way through. Just selling the next, well, not selling because they're free, but giving you information on the next couple of webinars. 22nd of July, Mastering the 200 with Julian Golding and Shani Palmer. 29th of July, Tips on how to transition from home to university as an athlete, hosted by Martin Owens. After that, there will be another series of these coming up, so please keep an eye out on the England Athletics newsletters and websites about what's coming up. Finally, it's the age-old, and there's more. Please drop me an email, send me your email details. I will send you all the videos tonight. I'll send you the presentation. I have some really in-depth videos of various other coaches talking about block starts, acceleration mechanics, some of the American coaches talking about them. Some of the American coaches actually starting to look at athletes and starting to change them. If you drop me an email, I'll send you a download link so you can download all of those and a few other articles which Mike Leonard and Mike Cutting have also sent through to me to share with you. So, you know, we're quite happy to pass our information out. If you have anything, can I ask you one thing? If you've got anything that you think might be useful to other coaches, could you send it through to me? If you've got any articles, any videos, anything that you've got that you think, actually, that's really good, send it to me. Let's all start sharing stuff. That way, we'll all become better coaches, because you're all here tonight because you want to be better coaches. I'm presenting tonight because actually I want to be a better coach, and doing this sort of stuff makes me go back and review everything. So please, anything you've got, share it through, drop me an email, and I'll share everything I've got back. But thank you very much for listening. Thank you for staying on. And, you know, any questions, please, in that email, ask me. It might take me a few days. I've got a few other outstanding emails to answer. Sally, I've got yours down to answer, and a few others. But if you have any emails that you need, anything you need, then any question you've got, please fire it, and I will answer it over the next week or so. So thank you very much, and have a good evening, everybody.